Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. My guest, Professor Ahmed Reid, teaches Caribbean history at CUNY's Bronx Community College. And as a Jamaican, he represents Latin America and the Caribbean on the United Nations Human Rights Council and serves as the chair of the UN's Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Welcome. That's a long title.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, please. I'm delighted to have you.
Okay.
So you teach Caribbean social and economic?
History, yes,
History.
At Bronx Community College.
And your doctorate was on
social and economic history.
It was,
yes.
Yeah. So how do your students, how do you like it?
It's wonderful. It's, being a teacher, the classroom there's great satisfaction being in the classroom. And so I enjoyed it tremendously, and I try to make it enjoyable to my students as well.
Are you a tough teacher?
Some of my students I think I'm fair but firm.
All right.
Yes.
And you cover the whole Caribbean area.
It's Pan-Caribbean, so English, French, Spanish-speaking.
What I've gathered from reading things about you is that you're an advocate and that you're really advocating as you teach.
Yes.
And that's a good thing.
Yes.
I like that.
Yeah.
Right. But you're doing contemporary things also.
Yes.
Yeah. So and one of the things you talk about, which connects into other things that you do, is a theory about the plantation economy.
Yes.
And I'd love you to explain that.
Yes. So I've always been what I call an activist scholar. I teach, I do my research, but I also believe that as a person of African descent, coming from Jamaica, coming from the Caribbean, and based on my experiences, it's important for not only to teach, but to be an activist in that sense, and I've always done so. My activism is to some extent linked to the question you've asked, in the sense that the plantation economy and that model which development economists put forward in the 1960s into the 70s, where they showed how the legacies of the plantation system and the harm and the continued harm even to this present day, where you see every day you walk in Jamaica or anywhere in the Caribbean, the legacies are there before you. You see those legacies. And so it has been disruptive towards Caribbean development. And in that sense, colonialism has impacted the Caribbean negatively and has left the Caribbean in what we call a mess, the colonial mess that was bequeathed to the people of the Caribbean. So in my lectures, yes, I teach the plantation economy model. I teach students how, colonialism and the impact colonialism had and has had have on the Caribbean region.
When you say that you can see the results, what do you mean?
So one quick result, in 1970, that's 8 years after some Caribbean countries got independence, the UNESCO did a survey on literacy in the Caribbean. And they said, well, I'll start with Jamaica, that 50% of Jamaica's population, 8 years after independence, was illiterate. That is 8 years after Britain walked away from Jamaica. So when you begin to think about sustainable development, then how can a country like Jamaica be on a path to sustainable development with 50% of its population illiterate? And it was even higher in some English-speaking Caribbean territories, with much higher, 60% in others, 65% in others. So the lack of development and the problems post-independent leaders have had in trying to get the Caribbean on a path to development, we see that every day. And the struggles and the problems and the economic problems that the region has encountered and continue to see every day. So yes, the legacies are there. You see the legacies every day. It manifests itself every day. And Caribbean and post-independence leaders have been trying to fix a colonial mess that colonial Europe left the Caribbean in. It was not a state or on a platform towards any form of development, whether human development or social development or any development of any kind.
So it all sprung
Yes.
from the slavery and the migration. I mean, it's not migration, it wasn't voluntary, from Africa into these colonies, right?
Yes, so...
And then the plantations, I mean...
Yes, because the plantation was one of exploitation. I mean, for 400 or 500 years of this system, the model was one of exploitation, where all the benefits and whatever produce was accrued at the time, it went in one direction and one direction only. So you see 400 years of exploitation. Then you go by the 1960s. We're 1960s between independence and now, we're talking just 50-something years. So 400 years of exploitation. You left a region where over half of its people are illiterate. So what sustainable development can they have in a short 50-year period? And so that is where, for some of us as scholars from the region or from the belly of the plantation, where our ancestors were enslaved Africans in that context, we are, as activist scholars, putting forward the argument that there's a moral obligation in this context to fix this problem.
That's what we call, does that come under what we call reparations?
Yes,
Right.
yes.
I think people think that reparations means that different families are going to get separate money. They don't understand the larger question, that it has totally denied the development that happened. Right?
Yes, it is a misunderstanding of what reparation truly is, and you're correct in suggesting that, because when Caribbean activists, scholars, are talking reparation, it is within the context of development. In 2013, the CARICOM heads of government met in Trinidad and formed what is now called the Caribbean Reparations Commission. And that commission put forward what was called a 10-point action plan. And if you look at the 10-point plan, it starts with a formal apology, number 1. Number 10, it ends with debt write-off. But the broader chapeau, if you will, of the 10-point plan is within the framework of development, because Caribbean people, they do have a right to development like any other individual anywhere else on planet Earth. And so reparations within this context is development. It's not, as you have alluded to, the misunderstanding that it's a check. No, it's development and a broad framework of development. So in that context, yes, you're right, and it's reparations broadly.
How many of the different countries are part of well, you don't call it federation?
No, the CARICOM, but the Caribbean Community, 15.
15?
Yes, including Haiti.
Has anybody not wanted to join?
No, it's a collective, because once you begin to show the legacies and show where relative to others the disparities, and I'll give you a quick example. In 2018, annually the UNDP, United Nations Development Agency, or program, they typically list their ranking of development and so forth. And if you look at most Caribbean countries, and especially those within CARICOM, they're ranked at the bottom. And Haiti, for example, is considered within that ranking as low development. Right? So once you begin to show and provide the research and the evidence that this is a situation facing Caribbean countries, that, we have had only 50 years to right the wrongs of 400 and 500 years of exploitation, then the message goes home because, leaders and the population and the Caribbean people begin to see that it is not for a lack of trying. Okay, the financial colonial mess, as we call it, and the financial difficulties and problems are all there, and they're all legacies of the past. So we do that. We try to show Caribbean people this is what it is.
Sure. It has a great resemblance to the problems in the United States with inner cities, right?
Yes.
And the whole question of development into those, housing, jobs, it's the whole thing.
All the inequities that you know, whether health or housing or social and economic, it's more or less the same.
Right.
Yes.
So that's why you're working at the UN, because that's basically the body that's most effective to go to.
Well, in this context, the working group that I'm a part of and which I chair at this point was mandated by the Human Rights Council in 2002, coming from the World Conference on Racism, to specifically look at the situation facing people of African descent globally. And so within the working group, we conduct country visits. We do 2 country visits per year. We have sessions, 2 sessions per year. And from those sessions and country visits, then we submit our report to the Human Rights Council and then to the General Assembly. And here we provide recommendations, and we provide recommendations to member states based on the countries that we've visited. And we also provide recommendations to the UN. And the purpose of all of this is to improve the human rights of people of African descent. And from the suggestion you made, and rightly so, that regardless of a person of African descent living in the US, in the inner city, or Jamaica, or anywhere else, wherever they are, the story remains the same. Mm-hmm. And therefore we have to find what is it that explains why Afro-descendants, wherever they are, continue to suffer and face these inequities.
It's a hard job, isn't it?
It is. Physically, it is. It is because it's a lot of traveling, and sometimes these meetings are extremely lengthy. But on a personal level, once it's over, once you're finished with a country visit, and you make a recommendation, you make recommendations to the member states, over time, a lot of these recommendations are taken on board. So there's some satisfaction there.
Does the UN allocate money to different projects?
So in that sense, what happened is, okay, I'll give you an example. We have had quite a few country visits. Because our mandate comes from the General Assembly resolution, there is money towards carrying out our work, to undertake these country visits, to have sessions, 2 sessions per year, and these things. So that's where the funds are to assist us to travel and to conduct the investigations.
But they don't do their own economic development, industrial projects and things like that.
Well, in some sense, yes, you have the UNDP, other agencies that do that. But our mandate is specific to study the situation of people of African descent and to make recommendations to improve their lives wherever they are.
Did I imagine it, or did you consider voter access in this country?
In 2016, the working group conducted a country visit. We were here for, I think, 11 or 12 days in 2016. And we called for reparations in 2016. But that issue and other issues came to the surface, and we made recommendations in that context. So yes, we considered it. It's not something you imagine. We did.
Do you and the people from the Caribbean work with other groups similar to yours in the United States? I don't mean similar, but like the NAACP or something like that. Is there a connection between it?
Well, we work with civil society organizations worldwide. Here in the United States, in the global north and the global south, and because we rely heavily on civil society. Civil society organizations are important to our work. They will meet with us. They sometimes bring to the surface the issues and the problems that they're facing. So we work.
Do an explanation. What kind of an organization do you think is civil society?
So there are civil society organizations that will, so for example, I don't want to call it by name.
Well, you could.
Well, okay, so for example, the U.S. Human Rights Network, I mean, we work very closely with them. We work extremely well with the World Council of Churches. So we meet with, I mean, they're not a civil society organization, but it's an example of the various bodies that we meet with, we discuss issues with, and we share ideas and so forth.
Right. So, do you like working with the UN?
Yes, I do.
How did you get to the UN? Did they come to you, or did Jamaica send you, or CARICOM?
Yes, good question. So what happened is that the UN has what is called special procedures. These are a group of independent experts. So you have a special rapporteur on housing, a special rapporteur on racism and so forth. So with this, what happened is you have a mandate and a time period with which to serve. It's usually 6 years. And then members rotate off once their term has ended. So when the vacancy came up, I applied. And I was interviewed by, I think it was 5 ambassadors. They're called the consultative group. I was ranked #1 based on the interview. And the recommendation was made to the Human Rights Council for my appointment. And so I was appointed. But at the end of it, it's the work that I'm doing did not just start with the UN. It has years of activism in Jamaica and the Caribbean, advocating for the improvement in the human rights situation of Caribbean people and people of African descent broadly.
What started you when you were a kid?
My professors. I am lucky enough, and I think quite a few of us in the Caribbean who went to the University of the West Indies. The university has a very long tradition of activist scholars. Walter Rodney being one of them. And so it was that tradition, being at the University of the West Indies, to see where professors were not just working within the ivory tower. Right. They were having groundings with their brothers and sisters outside of university. And that was the tradition with which that influenced me, and I aspired to as a young academic that this is what an academic should do. We have skills, and yes, we make important contributions, to society via the university. But how many people, and especially in the Caribbean, where a very small percentage will have the opportunity to go to university, then you can contribute broadly. And what I do, and in that context, is history education, trying to teach Caribbean people, those in Jamaica and elsewhere, to history education, because many of them will not be able to attend the halls of university and have that privilege in that sense. So it was that tradition, Walter Rodney. Then, you know, fast forward, you have Hilary Beckles, who is now the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Professor Vereen Shepherd, who taught me as well. So that's what started, where I started. That's where the influence came from.
Did they make the transition into public office, any of them?
Not to public office, but their activism is still strong.
When you talked about the professors and that what a role should be of somebody teaching, this is very minor, but my 7th grade civics teacher taught me about society and the role of a person and what citizenship means.
Yes.
And that kind of thing. And it was what started me on a career of politics and stuff as a reformer. So it's so important, but how do we do that with everybody?
You know, it's one of my greatest hope teaching at Bronx Community College is that my students will emulate what I do. Because my experience, I see where my experience coming from, being the first from my family to go to university. I see a lot of that with my students at Bronx Community College. And so I do hope, that's my greatest hope, that they will, in much the same way I was influenced by my professors, that, you know, I'll be of some influence to them in the sense that they will carry on that level of activism, social justice, contribution to not only the university but to society broadly speaking. And, you know, I can only hope that they will emulate me in that way. And I try as much as possible to put that to my students, that, you know, my experience is a similar experience as yours. And I know exactly what it means to go to university, and I have difficulties while at university. Mm-hmm. But those obstacles can be and hurdles, you can get over them. Mm. And, you know, the opportunities are endless as you strive for success.
Do they have, most of your students have Caribbean backgrounds?
Yes, a very, I think maybe 60% or maybe 70%, I think. I'm not sure what the exact numbers are of Caribbean background.
Is there resistance to terming a black using the word black population?
No, not from, I mean, we use the terminology just the same. Okay. I use the term black people all the time. You'll see people of African descent, some will say African ancestry. I try to tell my colleagues and whoever I come into contact with, well, at the end of the day, we're talking about the same people, same problems, and therefore what's important and what we should be focusing on is not so much a terminology, but how to elevate our constituency and how to, you know, come up with meaningful suggestions and how to, you know, overcome all the many difficulties. One of the things our working group did recently was we did a study on negative racial stereotypes. And I mean, we do hope that the recommendations that we made in this report, which was submitted to the General Assembly at the 74th session, just concluded 74th session, will be taken on board. So for me, in that sense, it's to improve the lives, whether you're living in the US, you're living in Canada, you're living in the UK or in Ecuador or Peru or wherever you are, problems are more or less the same.
Now, does that UN report get distributed in this country? People have to know something exists. I mean, I was really excited reading, well, I read your columns and some of the papers and learning about this. And it was all new to me. And it should come to here. We have a terrible problem in this country.
Well, I agree with you on that. And I think we need to do a much better job disseminating information. We have done, reports on artificial intelligence. We have done reports on stereotyping. We have had so many reports out, and the information is not getting out as broadly as it should. And I'll just say one other thing. We're also within what the UN is calling the International Decade for People of African Descent. And that's the issue. Not many people are aware.
Nobody knows. I was so surprised.
Of the International Decade, and in particular the three important pillars of the decade: recognition, justice, and development, and how cross-cutting they are and how important they are. And so I will agree with you. We need to do a much better job.
Well, maybe you'll come back and we'll talk some more.
Oh, thank you. I'll be more than happy to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.